The musical modes explained. In our very bizarre world of music, there are these things called modes. If you've ever been in music school or you've played an instrument for some time, you've probably heard of them. So, what are they? Why are they so special? And how can we use them in our own music? In this video, I will be answering all of these questions. A mode is basically when you take a regular scale and you change the root to a different note in that same sequence. First, I'm going to talk about the modes of the major scale. The major scale is the most useful and referential scale in Western music, and it consists of 7 notes. The 7 notes in this scale are diatonic, which means there's only one of each letter in the musical alphabet. On top of that, there are no double sharps or flats in this scale, and there's a specific pattern of whole steps and half steps seen here. We'll stick with C major as our example scale, as it is the easiest to talk about. C major consists of the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B. On the piano, C major is all the white keys, and it'll sound like this. And on the guitar, one version of the scale may sound like this. Within this 7-note scale, there are 7 unique modes, stemming from each respective scale degree, and each of them have their own names. They are Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. Let's focus on the first one, Ionian. Ionian mode is when you treat the first note in the major scale sequence as the root note. That means in our example, we would treat the C note as the root note. In other words, nothing actually changes. C Ionian is simply just the C major scale as it is. Ionian is just a modal name for major, really. The Dorian mode is when you treat the second note of the major scale sequence as the root note. In our example, D would become our new tonal center. That D note now becomes our new first scale degree, and we would move the C to the end as the new 7th. The scale would then become D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and it would sound like this. Dorian sounds pretty interesting. It's a little bit mysterious and also a little jazzy too. In terms of scale degree markings, notice how I put a flat symbol next to the 3rd and 7th. That's because compared to a parallel major scale, which in this case would be D major, the 3rd and the 7th are a half step lower. Parallel scales are something I talked about extensively in my last video on borrowed chords, linked below. But going forward, I will be marking the scale degree numbers with sharps or flats if they are altered from a parallel major scale. Phrygian mode is when you treat the 3rd note in the major scale sequence as the root note. In our example, that means that E would become our new root note, and we would move the C and the D towards the end. The new sequence of notes would be E, F, G, A, B, C, D. Phrygian has a slightly darker tone than most modes, and it sounds something like this. Compared to a parallel major, this scale has a flatted 2, 3, 6, and 7. Lydian mode stems from the 4th note in the major scale. F would become our new home base, and the sequence of notes would be F, G, A, B, C, D, E. The Lydian mode has a brighter sound. It's actually brighter than the typical major scale, and that's largely because its 4th degree is sharped. Here's what it sounds like altogether. Mixolydian derives from the 5th note in the major scale. For this mode, we would be starting on a G, and the sequence of notes would be G, A, B, C, D, E, F. This mode sounds kind of bluesy and very rock and roll. It's actually used a lot in a lot of the classic rock and hard rock songs that you might be familiar with. It has only a flat 7 compared to its parallel major, and it sounds like this. Aeolian derives from the 6th note of the major scale. In our example, that would be A, B, C, D, E, F, G, which is nice and easy to remember. And Aeolian is actually the same thing as the minor scale. Aeolian is simply the modal name for minor. And as a side note, if you want to find a major scale's relative minor, simply go to its 6th degree and see what the sequence of notes is if you start it from there. Aeolian mode sounds like this. Aeolian could be described as sad or forlorn sounding, and it has a flat 3, 6, and 7 compared to a parallel major scale. Our last mode is Locrian, which stems from the 7th degree of the major scale sequence. In our example, that would be B, C, D, E, F, G, A. Locrian has the darkest sound of all of the modes because it has a flat 2, 3, 5, 6, and 7 compared to a parallel major scale. The Locrian mode sounds like this. So those were the modes of the major scale. And they're not exclusive to C major. For example, in the E major scale, which has the notes E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, and D sharp, it would be the same lists of modes applying to its 7 notes in order. So, what's the use of modes? Well, modes are utilized in a variety of ways. Most modes of the major scale have a slightly exotic or unique sound which can be useful for composing. For instance, you could use modes to write an interesting melody or a riff. In one example, I tried writing a guitar riff in the mode of E Lydian instead of something more conventional. E Lydian is relative to the B major scale, so it has all the same notes except that the root note is E. So here's what my E Lydian riff sounds like on the guitar. Sounds pretty interesting. The defining note in the Lydian scale, as I stated before, is that sharp 4 note, which makes this sound a little brighter than the typical major sequence. You could also use modes to write chord progressions too. Did you know that the major scale, in addition to having 7 notes and 7 modes, also has 7 chords? The chords of the major scale consist of the scale's notes stacked in thirds. So by this logic, there are also chords in all of the modes too, because modes are simply the major scale just resequenced or reoriented. Let's do a chord progression in A Phrygian. A Phrygian is relative to F major, so it has all the same notes, but with a tonal center of A, so it shares the same chords too, except this A minor feels like the home chord. Here's what this progression sounds like. So yeah, pretty interesting sound, a little different from what we might typically be used to in popular music. When most musicians refer to the modes, they are generally speaking about the modes of the major scale, which is what we've been talking about so far. However, there are also modes of other common scales too. For instance, the melodic minor scale, specifically the ascending version of it, which is also called jazz minor, has a set of modes that are also commonly used. Starting from C, this scale would be C, D, E flat, F, G, A, B. It only has a 1-note difference than the regular C major, but that 1-note deviation is enough to give us some pretty interesting and spicy modes. The 7 modes of the melodic minor scale are C melodic minor, D Dorian flat 2, E flat Lydian augmented, F Lydian dominant, G Mixolydian flat 6, A Aeolian flat 5, and B Superlocrian. As a side note, a lot of the names for these melodic minor modes are pretty flexible, and occasionally they might be referred to as other things, depending on who you're talking to. For instance, Superlocrian might be referred to as the altered scale. The Lydian augmented scale might be referred to as Lydian sharp 5. A lot of these mode names derive from their similarity to a major scale mode name, with additional notation for what notes are altered. For instance, Dorian flat 2 scale is just the Dorian scale, but relative to that, it also, in addition, has a flat 2. The modes of the melodic minor scale or jazz minor scale are often used in jazz, and they're going to have a more unique or exotic sound compared to the regular modes from the major scale. Here's an example of me using Superlocrian or the altered scale in an improv over a jazz chord progression. Outside of major and melodic minor, there are other scales that have their own unique set of modes. However, most musicians don't venture outside of these two areas that much. But for your own curiosity, here are some other modes of other common scales up on the screen. So in this video, we discussed the most common modes and the ways that they can be used. There is a lot of songwriting and creative potential with these unique scales, so be sure to spend some time memorizing them on your instrument and then composing with them and seeing what you can come up with. Anyways, that's the video. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned a few things. Be sure to hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.